This is the opening page of George Kennan's famous 1946 long telegram sent from Moscow to the president and then distributed by the president. And it was this 5,000 word telegram that Kennan, who was a attaché in the US Embassy in the Soviet Union, wrote to sort of explain he had become an expert on Russian politics. And his father actually had quite famously traveled around through Siberia in any case. So he wrote this what's called the long telegram. And this is William Leahy's copy of it. It was a top secret document. And you can see William D. Leahy wrote his initials on it because every copy of it had to be accounted for because it was so secret. And I think that's kind of cool that one of the sort of cool things about studying history, and particularly American history, but the history generally of the Cold War and stuff, is that you get to, I've seen this actual physical document in the National Archives, and it's kind of cool that you're just like, wow, this is the actual document that Bill Leahy, the President's Chief of Staff, I say Bill Leahy, what I mean is Rear Admiral William Leahy, was looking at in 1946 when they were sort of discussing, like, okay, what's our policy toward the Soviet Union going to be, and how are we going to try and get through these next few years? Oh my God, it's time. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm John Foster. I know many of you. If I don't say who I am and why you should care what I think, like, people come up and ask me. So I'm a librarian here at Mentor Public Library. I have a PhD in history from the University of Washington. My specialty was Germany, particularly East Germany, but the Cold War period. So this is one of the few times when you're going to come in here and see me talking about something that sort of within my real area of specialization. In fact, sort of a long time ago, when the manager of the reference department at that time, who was 2 managers ago, I think, when I first came to work here, she said, you should do talks on history. And I said, well, that sounds great. And what I'm going to do is use it as an opportunity to talk about some things, to read some books that I'm interested in reading and talk about stuff. So a lot of what I do is stuff that I've kind of learned about. The first series of lectures that I did was military history, about which I know very little, sadly. And the very first one that I did was Midway, the Battle of Midway. And there are probably many of you in here who will know that naval warfare is its own special thing, especially modern naval warfare. Midway was the first, possibly the second battle, depending on how you look at the Battle of the Coral Sea, in which the main opposing forces, never saw each other. Like, Midway was the first, was completely a carrier action. And in fact, the Akagi, the Japanese flagship at Midway, was sunk by 2 bomb strikes, basically. But so anyway, I thought to myself, I'll give this talk, right? This happened in 1942. I'll be okay. And 3 people who showed up had actually been in the Battle of Midway, and they corrected some things, which is fine. Honestly, I really am okay with people who know correcting me, because I will get some things wrong. This is what makes the camera part of this kind of unnerving for me. But this stuff I know a little better off the cuff, so we'll just find out. Anyway, so I thought I would lecture this year about Cold War presidents. Well, this will have a lot of biographical information about Harry S. Truman. A lot of it, especially the latter part, is going to focus on the Cold War. And the reason is because the Cold War is a topic that really shaped the history of the 20th century. Starting with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, Europe changed fundamentally. I mean, in a way that it hadn't done since the French Revolution. So when the French Revolution happened in 1789, lots of people in Europe, especially people in governing circles and people sort of toward the top of the income distribution, got a little worried, right? Because once the Jacobins took control of the French Revolution, all bets were off. And people who had been in power were getting sent to the guillotine. And in the same way, the Bolshevik Revolution changed the equation for a lot of people in Europe, because once again, you had Russia, which had been under the Romanov family, maybe a little bit dysfunctional, but a sort of part of the comedy of nations in Europe. And then you get Lenin and his crowd taking over, and a complete reconfiguration of the political and economic life of the country. And also the underlying implication that this wasn't the kind of thing that was going to stay in Russia, right? That it was going to be, that the sort of larger directional flow of history, if you want to say, was going to be the expansion of this movement to other countries. As a matter of fact, it was a little weird to everybody that it actually happened in Russia. If you read the works of Karl Marx, Marx really thought that the way things would happen is that the industrial proletariat, the industrial workers, would become an increasingly large proportion of the population, and really to have the right kind of consciousness, to have the right kind of class consciousness, you had to be an industrial worker. Like peasants are basically just bourgeois people, and so the idea, if Marx had found out that this communist revolution had taken place in Russia, he would have been quite shocked. In fact, because Russia was predominantly agrarian, it had a very small industrial working class. And this is why, too, so Lenin and his people came along. Lenin says, well, we're not going to wait around for the revolution. Like, Marx kind of got it wrong. Like, if you have just like a small committed group of kind of revolutionary vanguard, we can kind of jump ahead past the sort of long industrialization step. But then, and this tells you a lot about sort of number one, this illustrates like how far away Leninism is from Marx's ideas. But number two, then Stalin comes along and is like, well, the peasants really are counter-revolutionary. So that's why you get the forced communalization and the grotesque famine in the Ukraine, which was completely made to happen. I mean, it wasn't accidental in any stretch, in which, several million people died. And this was very much the Bolshevik government disciplining the peasants who were by their lights, like all they wanted to do was be kulaks. All they wanted to do was be like richer peasants. They didn't have the right revolutionary consciousness. So anyway, from the perspective of the Western capitalist countries, this is a very alarming thing, right? Because all of a sudden, it changes the tenor of European politics. Because European politics used to be about like, France wants this, Germany wants that. Now you have like this sort of supposedly international workers movement. The question is, how is that going to influence the workers in our country? Or is it? Or, and then you get the Second World War. And Hitler at first goes after, what he wants is what he called Lebensraum, living space. The idea that the Germans should expand, take all this sort of agricultural land in Poland and the Ukraine. And then, so he's at first Hitler thinks, well, the British will be with me, right? Because we're all kind of Aryan. Aryan is a meaningless term in this. Like it's meaningless in the sense of being non-scientific. Aryans refers to a sort of ethnic group that existed in northern India a long time ago. The sort of mythology of that way of thinking is that the Aryans then came to Europe, which is completely untrue. But so the British are Aryan, right? Like they're white people like us. And he could never quite figure out why the British were not interested. And so there's this period after the fall of France where Germany doesn't invade Great Britain, and nobody can quite figure out why. Partly it was because he went to the Kriegsmarine and said, okay, let's invade. And the Kriegsmarine was like, there's no way. Because, by the way, you didn't call all the merchant ships home before you invaded Poland, so they all got seized by whatever government's port they happened to be in. But also, there's no way we can get troops across the English Channel without the Royal Navy putting them at the bottom of the water. So he engages in this sort of air campaign against Britain. But then finally, he attacks Russia. And when he did, the morning that he did, Churchill had sort of left instructions that he was not to be woken early unless, like, Britain was being invaded, so he wasn't. But then when he woke up and they told him, at least according to his biographer, William Manchester, he woke up and they told him, oh, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and he said something like, eastward ho, because with a certain sort of levity, but the idea was like, well, that's great, like, he can go kill communists for a while. And also, this is great for Britain because it means that he's taken his act somewhere else. But then at a certain point, then Churchill makes this speech on the floor of the House of Commons talking about, wanting to help Stalin and wanting to help the Soviet Union against this unjustified attack. And one of his advisors came to him later and said, wasn't it a little weird, saying all these kind of nice things about Stalin? Churchill was very, very anti-communist. And his response was, if Hitler had invaded hell, I would endeavor to say some positive things about the devil on the floor of the House of Commons. But so the upshot of this is we were allies, we and the British and the French were allies of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. But very quickly after the end of that war, and actually even during that war, starting if you look at the documents, the historical documents of the State Department, the discussions that started in 1943, what are we going to do about the Soviet Union after the end of the war? And that's a big question. Because, at a certain point, the kind of tenor of things changes, and this became very pronounced after the end of the war. There was what was called Operation Paperclip, which was a project undertaken by the U.S. government to grab up all the Nazi scientists and bring them here. The Russians did the same thing in a little more sort of forceful way because, frankly, given the choice between being swept up and taken here and being swept up and stuck in some laboratory in Novosibirsk, I can tell you which I'd prefer. And so, Wernher von Braun, the father of the U.S. rocketry program, was an SS major. And just to be clear, in case anyone is under any doubts about this, nobody ended up in the SS accidentally. After the war, it's funny, if you ever watch The World at War, there's an episode on the concentration camp system, and they end up interviewing Kurt Wolff, who was a SS general. And he makes it seem like, well, I just knew some people from the war, and then all of a sudden I'm in the SS. No. Nobody was in the SS who didn't really want to be. So anyway, the upshot of this is that, but the thinking was, who makes a better anti-communist, right, than an ex-Nazi? And now that by their perspective, Nazism wasn't a going concern anymore. But so a lot of these talks are going to be sort of center on the idea of how it was that U.S. presidents tried to cope with the Cold War, how it was that, how it affected their thinking. And Truman was thrown into the absolute deep end. And here's how. 12th of April, 1945, Truman is in Sam Rayburn's office. There's a phone call. He's vice president at this point. He's been vice president for 83 days, I believe, at this point. And they say the vice president needs to come to the White House immediately. Truman, I think, was roughly aware that Roosevelt was out of town. He had been brought onto the ticket kind of late as a replacement for Henry Wallace. Wallace was viewed by Democratic insiders as being too far to the left, and they thought that the election was going to be close, so they wanted to put someone else on the ticket. This may be the moment for this story. So Truman, I recommend A.J. Bames' The Accidental President, excellent recent book about this topic. But Truman, there was a lot of backroom shenanigans to get Truman on the ticket. Truman absolutely did not want to be on the ticket. He had not been totally thrilled about being in the Senate. He really wanted to be governor of Missouri, but the people with whom he was associated said, no, we need to have someone else for that. We want you to be senator. But he had really gotten on quite well in the Senate. He'd been in the Senate since, I think, 1936. But he really did not want to be the vice president. Cactus Jack Garner from Texas once famously said that the vice presidency was not worth a pitcher of warm piss. And the vice presidency was often a place where you stashed people whose political career you wanted to top out right there. But so anyway, they have this kind of backroom thing going on. Roosevelt didn't really care who the vice president was and just wanted them to sort it out. But Truman had been sort of pitched to him. He knew who Truman was because of the Truman Commission, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But so finally, they're at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Truman, they bring him up to this hotel room. They call Franklin Roosevelt, who's in San Diego at this point because his health was not very good. And Franklin Roosevelt, in the later part of his life, somebody somebody told me what his blood pressure was, and his systolic pressure was over 200, which is a person who's like had heart surgery. It's the kind of thing that really sends a shiver up your spine. But so he's in this room, and they call Roosevelt. Roosevelt habitually talked on the phone so loud that whoever he was talking to had to hold the phone away from his ear. And they sort of ask him, Franklin, what do you, Mr. President, Harry Truman's here, and I know you want him on the ticket, but he's not totally convinced. And Roosevelt said, well, you tell that stubborn Missouri mule that if he wants to destroy the Democratic Party, i.e. by refusing to be on the ticket, that's going to be on him. And then he rang off. And Truman, sitting there on a bed kind of across from where the phone was, apparently, according to his own testimony and the testimony of everyone who else was there, his first words on hearing this were, oh shit. So he becomes vice president. He's vice president for 83 days. And then he goes to the White House and he finds out that Franklin Roosevelt has died down in Warm Springs. And the first thing he does is goes up to the residence to see Eleanor. Eleanor he kind of liked, and she kind of liked him. She liked him because he was very straightforward and a nice guy. And he liked her because she was full of ideas and just a really pleasant person and very much more straightforward than Franklin was. Franklin Roosevelt was a great president, but as I was mentioning sort of earlier, he had an unfortunate habit of telling people what he thought they wanted to hear. And he always thought that he could kind of soft-soap people. He thought he could soft-soap Stalin, which turned out not to be true. I mean, Stalin, by the way, Stalin could really be a fairly engaging person if he wasn't actively trying to have you murdered. And Roosevelt, or Churchill, found that he actually rather liked Stalin in the sort of like social, sort of in moments of kind of conviviality or what have you. Although what Churchill understood about Stalin was that the man was he was a habitual liar, but that once you knew what Stalin wanted, you could generally predict what he was going to do. Roosevelt never quite got the memo on that. Anyway, so Truman goes up to the residence to see Eleanor, and she's in there, and she's it's a moment of real grief for her because their relationship had been very rocky. And the beginning reason for it was that Franklin had slept with her social secretary, among other people. But she really loved him, and he really loved her. Their relationship had problems. But so Truman says to her, is there anything I can do for you? And Eleanor says, in one of the quintessential Eleanor Roosevelt lines, if you know anything about Eleanor Roosevelt, this is a perfect example of her, of of her spirit. She said, the question is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one who is in trouble now. Because she understood he had just been tossed right into the deep end. He had just been tossed into a job that's already extremely difficult, but in an extremely fraught moment. And so we're going to jump back a little and just talk about Harry Truman growing up and what made him the kind of person that he was. And then I'll talk a little bit about how he dealt with some of the challenges posed to him by the Cold War. He was born in Lamar, Missouri, out in western Missouri, and on the 8th of May, 1884. His family were farming people. His father, John Truman, who, unfortunately, the light is kind of shining on him, but there he's right there, was a dealer, a livestock dealer, a farmer, and a sort of dealer in land. John Truman was one of those guys who always had a fiddle going. Like, he always had a plan for something that was going to make him a lot of money, and it never worked out. He was ruined several times. In 1901 particularly, he took a real bath on cattle futures. They moved to the area of Kansas City. They had a farm out that way. Harry was a page at the 1900 Democratic National Convention. He worked as a youth, first in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star. Then, after graduating from high school in 1901, he worked as a timekeeper on the railroad. And basically what his job was to supervise work crews and record how much time people had worked, and then to do the payroll, which always happened on a Friday and always happened in a saloon. So he would show up with the money in the saloon and he would pay it out to the guys, and then the guys would do what you do in a saloon until the money was all gone, and then they worked for another week. There you go. But he became, and he had to, go out and live with these guys in the tent camps, eating greasy food and listening to their extremely profane discussions. But he was very much liked by the guys he worked with because he had a reputation for scrupulous honesty. He was always very honest about the proper recording of people's times, and he was always very honest about people getting the right amount of money, which made him very popular among his coworkers. Then he worked as a clerk in the National Bank of Commerce. Eventually, he had to move back to the farm, the family farm, in 1906 because they needed more help. And he spent the next 5 years and more walking behind a plow. I mean, he probably is the last U.S. president who will ever have, spent the day plowing furrows, and he's probably the last U.S. president who could reliably plow a straight furrow. He's also the last U.S. president, probably, who never had a college education. He went to a commercial college for about a year, and then went to law school on and off for a couple of years, but didn't have much higher education after that. He courted Bess Wallace, who he met in Sunday school and who he immediately fell in love with. He asked her to marry her in 1911. She said no. Because he was a guy with not a lot of prospects, and that was an important thing back then. The Truman family farm was not any great shakes. They were good farmers, but they weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. And the vast majority of the work on the farm was not being done by hired people; it was being done by members of the Truman family. He joined the Missouri National Guard in 1905. Between 1905 and 1911, he served as an artillerist in the Missouri National Guard. He was rejected at first. He wanted to get an appointment to West Point and was denied an appointment because his eyesight was so bad. His eyesight was 20/50 in one eye and 2400 in the other, so he was really blind as a bat. He was originally rejected by the Missouri National Guard and then went ahead and just memorized the eye chart. And so got in the second time around. In the intervening period, I'm actually going to skip ahead one because I was never sure about the order, but putting the order of these slides, but I'll talk about this now. Harry Truman inherited from his father the sort of idea of trying to do these things to sort of augment his position. And so in 1915, he bought into a zinc mine in Commerce, Oklahoma, or outside of Commerce, Oklahoma. And he and his partner used to drive down there. They bought this car and they would drive down to several hours down to Oklahoma. The thing went bust. He lost his shirt. In 1916 and 1917, he speculated in oil futures. This also lost him a lot of money, or his whole stake. And then in 1922, he and his buddy Eddie Jacobson started a haberdasher store in Kansas City, which also went bust because of there was a recession in 1921 in which a lot of businesses went bust. And which he ended up on the hook for, I think, $5,600, which was a lot of money in those days, and which took him a couple of decades to pay off. But he, and this will tell you a lot about the character of Harry Truman, refused to declare bankruptcy and said, I'm going to pay this money off. And there were some complications involved, but he eventually did pay off the money that he owed on that. So I'm going to switch back here because in April 1917, the United States enters the First World War. Truman goes back into the U.S. Army. This is one of the only pictures that you'll ever see of Harry Truman not wearing his glasses. He's wearing them right there, and he's wearing them up there. He was put in charge of an artillery battery that was composed almost entirely of Irishmen and Catholics, which Truman was neither, and which had a reputation for carousing and for abusing its officers. And Truman really laid the law down to them. He said later that the most frightened he ever was in his life was the first day he stood out in front of that battery. But once he made clear what his expectations were, they got on very well. And there was very intense loyalty among those guys to him ever afterward. As a matter of fact, they used to stage reunions that got notoriously wild. They had one in Kansas City in which someone brought a cow into the room, and there's all sorts of shenanigans that went on. But they also, whenever Truman needed help, whenever he was in political difficulties, the guys from the battery would rally around him. March of 1918, he goes to France. he gets there in April, goes to the French artillery school, which he thought was the, sort of one of the most interesting things that had ever happened to him. The artillery is a very interesting branch of the service, right? Because there's the infantry, and then there's the cavalry, which tends to be sort of aristocratic because you have to be able to ride a horse. The thing about the artillery is you got to know how to do math, right? Because if you cannot do the calculation, the chances that you will put the shell where it needs to be and where everyone else is expecting it to be go down quite dramatically. And because Truman worked to make himself very good at this, he didn't have a huge amount of native facility with it, but he was a hard worker. He mastered the skill, and then they saw fairly heavy combat in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. I will say that if I had to choose a role that I was going to be in land combat, I think the artillery would be the one, although I'm not that great at math, but it just seems like if things work the right way that they're supposed to, obviously counter battery fire is an issue, but I like my chances as an artillerist. Once again, unlike many of his colleagues over there, he did not disport himself in the flesh pots of France. And the reason was, once again, he had committed himself to Bess, and he was a one-woman guy. And he returns in April 1919. He asks her to marry him. This time she says yes. I guess his prospects had improved. I mean, now he was going to open the haberdashery store. I will mention, too, so some of you will have noticed that Jacobson is a very Jewish-sounding name. Eddie Jacobson was Jewish. Truman grew up in an area in which certain varieties of racism were very common. As a young man, he often referred to people of African-American descent with a word beginning with N. He later moved on from that, and quite consciously so. Also, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in that particular part of the country. Eddie Jacobson was, at that time and for many years, for the rest of their lives, one of his best friends. And Eddie Jacobson actually lobbied him very assiduously and quite successfully in 1948 to get him to sign the treaty recognizing the State of Israel. 22, he's elected a county judge. This is Tom Pendergast, the head of the local political machine. The Pendergast machine was not as grim in its sort of tactics as, say, Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall, you really did want to, and I say this as a person of proud Irish descent, but Tammany Hall, you really did want to stay on the right side of them if you wanted your kneecaps to stay intact.
He looks like Hoover.
He does, sort of. You're not wrong. Truman had known, I believe, one of his younger brothers who sort of made the connection for him. Truman was elected judge for the Eastern District of Jackson County, Missouri, which was an administrative position. It wasn't sit in a courtroom and adjudicate cases. He was responsible for administrative stuff. He was responsible for a long time for road building, different construction projects, which he always brought in on time and under budget. And this is a key thing, he let Pendergast know that he would happily give jobs to people he sent along, but that Pendergast ought only to send along people who were willing to do a day's work for the money. And this is a key thing about Truman. He was dogged for the rest of his career, pretty much, by the sort of senator from Pendergast, by the Pendergast connection, because people knew about Pendergast. People knew that Pendergast later was sent to federal prison for manipulation of votes and other sorts of things. People sort of say, how did that work, right? Why did they want Truman around? Well, Truman was notoriously honest. And if you're the Pendergast, the people running the Pendergast machine, you think to yourself, well, people come to you and are like, you people are criminal, or your people are crooked. Like, we're not crooked. Look, we got Truman. Everyone knows he's honest. And that very much was part of the logic of having him around. He became a presiding judge in 26. And then in 33, he becomes the director of the Missouri Federal Reemployment Agency. Once again, this was a gift to Pendergast from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to thank Pendergast for his support for the New Deal. In the context of this, he met and became friendly with Harry Hopkins, who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's sort of fixer. Hopkins was a Midwesterner. He went to Grinnell College, a fact which I know because I was born in Grinnell. My father was a professor at Grinnell. My mother went to Grinnell. Hopkins is a fascinating guy, by the way. I really I recommend reading the parts of William Manchester's Churchill biography that deal with him, because there's this famous moment, if I may digress for a moment, where Hopkins is sent in 1941 to Britain by Franklin Roosevelt to see how the Brits are getting on, whether they're going to, whether it's worth the U.S. trying to support them, right? And Hopkins toured around, went to various places, met lots of people in British war industries, the British government. And then finally, before he's going to leave, he went to this dinner with Churchill and some of the British government higher-ups. And they got to the end of the meal, and Hopkins stood up and he said, well, I guess you're all wondering what I'm going to tell my government when I go back to the United States. And I think the best way I can put it is from this line from the Bible. And then he says, whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou restest, I will rest. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God, even until the end. And Churchill wept when he heard it, because he knew that Hopkins telling Roosevelt that the British were a going concern would mean that the United States would support them, which meant that the British Empire would survive. Just as an aside and unrelated to what we're really talking about here, but I think this is fascinating, that he quoted from memory these lines from the Book of Ruth in the King James Bible, and it was a language that they both understood, right? Because the King James Bible is so firmly fixed in the cultural life of English-speaking people that sometimes you'll say things and we're like, oh yeah, that's a line from the King James Bible. Like it comes out of our pores sometimes. If you ever read, I will say this and then get back on topic. If you ever read Melville, especially Moby Dick, Melville quotes the King James Bible so often it's kind of dizzying. And the reason he's doing it is because it's a language that everyone understands. It's going to be familiar. And so he can use these lines, that the whaling ship smells like the left wing of the Day of Judgment, I think is what he says. That it's that he doesn't have to explain further. Anyway, 1934, Truman is elected for the U.S. Senate. He wanted to be governor. And the Pendergast machine said, no, we have someone else who we want to be governor. But you can go to the Senate. Truman didn't really want that. And the reason was he didn't really want to leave Missouri. And he knew that Bess really didn't want to leave Missouri. And when Bess found out that this was in planning, she was not best pleased. Always talk to your wife before you're going to run for high political office, I think, is the message here. Although she put up with a long time in Washington, that being said, she frequently went back to Independence, Missouri, where their house was, and stayed there. Partly because the I don't know if any of you have spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. The climate there is, it was bad when they put Washington, D.C. There was a swamp, basically, and it didn't get much better for a long time. And I used to live in Southern Maryland. It's incredibly humid there. Oh my gosh. You think it's humid here, but so he's elected to the U.S. Senate. They asked him, why was it he associated with the Pendergast people? And he said, well, I offered them a little and they gave me a lot. And the point that he was trying to make was he didn't really have to do, he let them know he wasn't going to do anything that he thought was dishonest, but that he would support them. And they went a long way to get him elected. Also, this is a really interesting thing. At a certain point, the Ku Klux Klan was very powerful in that part of Missouri in those days. And the Ku Klux Klan went to Truman when he was running and said, we want you to come to one of our meetings. We want you to join. And Truman was a little iffy about it, but he also held some views which made him not entirely alien to that sort of way of looking at things. But he went to a Klan meeting and he was like, God, this is just terrible. I'm out of here. And he never had anything to do with the Klan after that. And in fact, he was accused of having sympathized with the Klan afterward, and he was able to point out, look, yeah, I was involved with the Klan for about 10 minutes at one point in the 1930s and then got away from those guys. Pendergast around this time gets busted on federal charges and ended up going to prison. Truman never abandoned him. And in fact, he died right after Truman became president. I believe. And Truman went to his funeral. And a lot of people were like, my God, why did you do that? Like, what? And Truman said, look, he was my friend, and he helped me a lot. And, okay, he had these problems, but I'm not going to turn my back on a friend because of that. Like, he didn't, I wasn't the wronged party there, so I'm not going to, which didn't come off very well, admittedly. When he first got to the Senate, he made friends with a senator from, it may have been Vandenberg, it was one of the senators from Michigan, and he said, whoever it was, said to him, you'll spend your first year wondering how you got here and the next 5 wondering how we all did. Truman got along well in the Senate, once again, because he was a very affable man. He's the kind of guy you could sit down and have a drink with, even if you disagreed with him, and he would talk straight to you. And he was happy to disagree with people, but he was also just a very pleasant person. He ended up getting on the Appropriations and Interstate Commerce Committees. 1941, December 41, the United States enters the Second World War after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And he starts visiting military bases to find out what's going on there, because he's wondering where all the money's going. And lots of people were. And in fact, the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress in the House of Representatives were trying to put together a committee to investigate, which seemed to have a very militant sort of tone to it. And Franklin Roosevelt said, well, one of his advisors suggested, Truman wants to start a committee, a Senate committee, a Senate subcommittee to investigate. Why don't we give the job to him? Because Truman's at least a little more, not quite as on the warpath about the whole thing. So they allowed Truman to form what's called the Truman Committee, or the Truman Commission, to investigate how military appropriations were being spent as an alternative to a worse option involving the House of Representatives. And he, starting with a skeleton staff, went around to an incredible variety of places and rooted out all kinds of waste. I mean, eventually it's estimated that they saved the government something on the order of $15 billion in 1940s money. So that's about $260 billion. But, at a certain point, he went to Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, and said, there's this program that you seem to be running, and I can't figure out what it's about, but it's gobbling up tons and tons of money. And Stimson said, yeah, that's true. I can't tell you what it's about. Please don't investigate it anymore. And Truman said, okay. And then he went and tried to investigate it and sort of kept going to these facilities where they were saying, sorry, Senator, you just cannot come in here. And it turned out that this was the Manhattan Project, which he then only found out about in April of 1945. So Truman gets brought onto the Democratic ticket almost immediately as he becomes the sort of vice president. He's at this National Press Club thing. He's a very avid and quite skilled piano player. And so he's at the National Press Club. And who comes up on stage but the young and extremely beautiful Lauren Bacall, who sits down on the top of the piano with her lovely long legs and sings a song, which Truman was very surprised about. They didn't tell him in advance that this was going to happen. And if you thought he was surprised, Bess was really surprised and not very happy. But, she really had nothing to worry about, because once again, Truman was interested in exactly one woman in the world, and it was Bess. God love him. 83 days into his tenure as vice president, Roosevelt dies. And all of a sudden, Truman becomes president. At his first press conference, he said to the assembled reporters, boys, if you ever prayed for me, pray for me now. And people were really wondering, how is this guy going to handle this position? I mean, really, he didn't have a great reputation. I mean, he had a reputation as a kind of a rooter out of overspending, but he didn't have great rep in terms of international politics, in terms of positively running the military. I mean, he was a little bit of a non-entity. And also, Franklin Roosevelt had a very big personality, which Truman didn't have. Truman had a sort of kind of a high-pitched nasal voice, and he was a little guy, and he didn't really have that gravitas that Roosevelt had, even over and above the fact that Roosevelt had been president for almost 14 years. I mean, there were people in their teens who couldn't remember any other president. On the 16th of July, 1945, the Trinity bomb test happens. Earlier in April, Stimson had pulled Truman aside and told him what the Manhattan Project was all about and what the weapon was all about. Truman goes off to the Potsdam Conference in Germany, which he very much did not enjoy, in which the shape of Europe in the post-war era was negotiated. And this was really the first moment of what would become the Cold War. You have Churchill, Stalin, Truman, de Gaulle there negotiating. And there's this moment, many of you have heard me tell this story, but I'm going to tell it again because it's my 100% favorite historical anecdote, and it is this. Truman told this story later, that they were at one of these meetings. It had to be relatively early in the conference because about a third of the way in, the British government fell, and Churchill had to go back for a new election, and then the Conservatives lost, and he was out. But so anyway, they're having this discussion. Churchill had, in the context of, I believe this happened at Yalta, he was having a sort of late night conversation with Stalin, and Stalin let him know that what he was going to do, what he was planning to do, was take about the eastern 200 miles of Poland, make that part of the Soviet Union, and compensate Poland by about the eastern 200 miles of Germany. And Churchill thought to himself, well, okay, the question about this is, are we willing to go to war about this right now? Because that's the only way to stop Stalin from doing it, right? And his answer was no. We're not ready to go to war with the Soviet Union over this. So anyway, they're at the conference, and Churchill says to Stalin, well, you know, the Pope is pretty upset about the treatment of Catholics in Eastern Poland. And Stalin, in a kind of amused way, was like, the Pope? The Pope? How many divisions has he? And this, I love this story because it really perfectly sums up Stalin's attitude toward the world. He was very honest about it, like, I have 200 divisions. So what I say goes there is what's going to go on. And if the Pope doesn't like it, that's really tough luck for him. Because, you know, and Stalin could be very blunt like that. He really had no reason, he didn't sugarcoat it in the slightest. While they were at the conference, Truman mentioned to Stalin that they had the bomb, that they had tested this new weapon. Stalin already knew. Not, and I beg you to believe me on this topic, there's a sort of persistent rumor backed up by a very tiny amount of evidence that Oppenheimer had spilled the beans. Klaus Fuchs spilled the beans. Like the Soviet archives have been opened up, and we know very clearly what the recruiter who was trying to sort of get people going said about who he was recruiting and what they would do. And they really didn't have much luck with Oppenheimer. People on the political right didn't like Oppenheimer because they saw him as a kind of a leftist. But Oppenheimer wasn't the guy. I mean, it was very clear. I mean, we know for a certainty that Klaus Fuchs gave them information. There's probably some other people, but probably I don't think Oppenheimer. I don't think there's very good evidence for the Oppenheimer thing. And I say this because somebody at another talk I was giving really got in my ear about it. If you're really interested, I can come to the reference desk and I can point you to the evidence vis-a-vis this. But Stalin knew already that was the case. On the 6th, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and then on the 9th, the second one was dropped on Nagasaki. There was some discussion in the U.S. government about whether this should be done. Truman never seemed to have much doubt, but Truman came to the process late, right? And he knew that a fabulous amount of money had been spent on this thing. He also knew that the War Department was estimating that there would be between 400,000 and 500,000 U.S. combat fatalities if we invaded Japan. In fact, someone told me, and I believe this is probably true, that Purple Hearts that they were giving out up through the Vietnam War had been minted at that time because they expected to need them for the invasion of Japan. And how many Japanese people would have been killed in this is just... And they were worried about that, too. I mean, these people were not bloodthirsty, crazy people. To be clear, when they dropped the bombs, between the two cities, roughly 105,000 people were killed, which seems like a lot. But that's not as many people as were killed in the firebombing of Tokyo. Firebombing cities had become a thing from 1943 onward. The British, the Royal Air Force had done studies involving firemen about how to make buildings burn. And they had discovered, or they had decided that the best way to do it. So the number one thing you have to know is that bombing factories is really inefficient. They tend to be made of materials that don't burn very readily. They did studies that showed when you bombed factories and railway lines that they tended to get back into working order relatively quickly. They tend to be a little spaced out. So what they discovered was that bombing, or what they decided was that bombing the places where the people who worked in the factories lived was a lot more effective, because they tend to live in tightly packed quarters in buildings predominantly made out of wood. And what they figured out was that you send over one flight of bombers that bomb the roofs off, and then you send over another flight of bombers that drop something called a fire stave. It's about that long. It's a hexagonal item that starts a phosphorus burn. And the consequences could be startling. I mean, the firestorm in Dresden is a very notable instance of this. In 1944, the sort of dry run for that was the firebombing of Hamburg, which essentially vaporized the city. We firebombed Tokyo, which is a city predominantly made of wood. The estimates vary, up around 120,000 people were killed in essentially 1 or 2 nights of bombing. So the thinking of a lot of people in the US military about the atomic bomb was, okay, it's you know, a big boom, right? But it's not a difference in kind. It's a difference in degree. Like it's just a bigger boom, but it's not a different kind of thing than we've been doing to cities for 2.5 years now. By the way, the British used to bomb at night. The US would bomb during the day, and the reason was because it was easier to hit targets that way. But the British would bomb at night because it was safer for their crews. It was safer for the bomber crews. And at one point, someone from the US, the 8th Air Force, went to Bomber Harris, and the head of the British Air Command was like, doesn't it worry you that you're really not hitting, necessarily the thing you're bombing? And Bomber Harris was like, what are you going to do? Because they really, the bombing campaign was very costly for U.S. air crews. I mean, really, you have to tip your hat to those guys in the 8th Air Force, because they really exposed themselves to some extremely dangerous conditions. Anyway, so the second bomb, it was pretty clear that the Japanese were on the point of surrendering after the first one. Then they dropped the second one 3 days later, and people often ask why. And there's a couple of, it's not entirely locked down clear, but part of it was to sort of make the process happen more quickly. But one reason why they did want to is because on the 9th of August, just prior to this happening, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And the fear was that the Soviet Union would then move into Manchuria in northeastern China. And the US government really wanted to forestall that, because what were they thinking of now? Well, the war is going to be over, and our new problem is going to be communism.
Why did the Soviets have any interest in invading Japan?
Because they wanted a part of the post-war settlement. And because they foresaw, correctly as it turned out, that the US would have significant military forces in Japan, which would be part of the US policy of containment of the Soviet Union and subsequently of China. The Japanese surrender on the 14th of August, 1945. These are a couple, so I'm not going to go quite into this so much, the recognition of Israel, although it is important, but partly it was done as a sort of post-Holocaust, like the Jews have suffered this horrible thing. the Berlin blockade is in a way a sort of like more interesting, relevant thing to our sort of Cold War agenda here, and it was because the sort of Germany was divided up into 4 parts. Each Allied group got a zone, and the Russians got the eastern zone, which had Berlin in it. Now, what Stalin wanted was a unified Germany that was neutral. What he got was the East German statelet, and he was also forced by the terms of the treaty to allow Berlin was also split into 4 zones. And Stalin wanted to sort of eliminate that situation without starting a war, which he really didn't want. I mean, 25 million Russians had died in the Second World War. I think they'd had enough of it for a while. That being said, and just to frame everything that I'm going to talk about in the subsequent half hour, one of the biggest fears of American policymakers and European policymakers in the period between 1945 and 1989, almost, I mean, maybe less so toward the end, was that the Soviets would invade Europe. I don't think that the Soviets were ever in much danger of invading Europe. But the possibility that they would really inflected the strategic thinking of all. I mean, NATO was basically founded. NATO was founded according to Pug Ismay, the British governmental figure, to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. But so in June of 1948, Stalin sort of blocks off access to Berlin. And then there's what's called the Luftbrücke, the air bridge, where famously the Allies created, really mostly us, created this incredible system whereby Berlin was supplied with food and coal for heating on the system of landings where every 30 seconds or so a plane would come through. And when they did, by the way, the kids would hang around Tempelhof airfield. They've closed down Tempelhof, but I think there's the Luftbrücke Memorial, so there. The kids would hang around, and the flyers would throw boxes of like raisins, and chocolate out the back. They were called Rasinenbomber, raisin bombers. Part of the problem was that the communists in East Germany, in what became East Germany, actually formed East Germany, which Stalin really didn't want and was very upset about. It's so hard to get good henchmen. But he was very upset when they were like, yes, we formed our own communist state. He's like, idiots, that's not what I want. What I want is a neutral, because the other 3/4 of Germany is in the hands of the capitalists. Like, why would I possibly want that? So there's a big question of what's to be done about military conflict with the communists. George Kennan writes this, what's called the Long Telegram, in which he said, look, the Soviet Union has this ideology which sees a fundamental and unresolvable conflict between communism and capitalism. But they're also terrified about getting invaded, right? So what they want is to spread Soviet power, but also to sort of create this sort of buffer zone. So what Kennan comes up with is the idea of what's called containment. So what we need to do, instead of having like a direct conflict with the Soviets, we need to contain them so they don't spread further. And that idea really shaped U.S. policy for a large proportion of the period between 46, when the Long Telegram is sent, and 1989. In March 1946, Churchill gives a speech at a college in Missouri in which he uses the phrase the Iron Curtain, talking about the Soviet Union's move to create a sort of zone of influence in Eastern Europe. And everybody sort of knew it was happening. I mean, the Soviets really thought that they were only doing what we were doing, honestly. So there's a very famous sort of story about Truman's first meeting with Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, in which he really took Molotov to task in very pointed terms about the Soviet moves in Poland and Czechoslovakia. And Molotov is supposed to have said to him, well, nobody's ever spoken to me like that before, and to which Truman responded, well, if you keep your agreements, no one will speak to you like that again. This may or may not have happened. There's various stories from the people who were there, but Truman did, I mean, it is clear, speak in very pointed terms to Molotov about what he expected. Molotov, that we know, has a sort of diary entry after that in which he said, Poland, what a big deal. Like, because he really felt like we were sort of creating governments favorable to us in France and in Italy, which we were, and in Greece, which we later did. But that's a long way away from the systematic policy that the Soviets engaged in which they were very much the minority in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and in which they just systematically extirpated the forces of democratic government there. 1947, Truman gives a speech to a joint session of Congress in which he enunciates what's called the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine is that the United States is going to make positive moves to oppose communist expansion wherever it happens. And the context of this was there was a communist insurgency going on in Greece at the time. And also Turkey was threatened by the Soviet Union, which really wanted access to the Black Sea. Truman came out and said, look, we're gonna back this up with money. We don't want to instigate a military conflict with the Soviets, but what we want to do is create a situation in which they can't take advantage and engage in these expansionist policies. The other major instance of this, and I will just say that I told my history teacher one time, my high school history teacher, that I'd gotten a PhD in history, and she nearly fainted dead away because I was not a great student in high school. And part of the reason was that I really just didn't take notes. I have since trained myself to take notes, which I'm not going to use. In 1947, Lucius Clay, who was the head of the Allied military government in Germany, got an industrialist named Louis Brown, who was a big producer of asbestos, sadly enough, but anyway, to tour around Europe and around Germany and create a report about what the conditions were. And the picture that he painted was very bleak. Many European countries were on the verge of bankruptcy. And you have to remember that in the 1920s and 1930s, okay, so there's the Great Crash of 29. Before that in Germany in 1922, there had been a hyperinflation in which the annual inflation rate got to be something like 6 times 10 to the 5th power or something. I mean, it was just something. It was so, the hyperinflation in Germany in 1922 was so bad that if you were going to order dinner in a restaurant, you wanted to pay for it when you ordered it, because by the time you got to the end of the meal, it was going to be more expensive. And generally speaking, and then you get the crash of 29, the depression into the 1930s, and this had created a feeling among a lot of people that capitalism was not a great idea. I mean, and coincidentally or connectedly, that communism was in fact a great idea. And people sort of look back on it now, it's like, Christ, how could you look at communism and think that was a good idea? The reason was because capitalism seemed to be working so badly, right? And there was a lot of sympathy for communism in Europe in the 1940s, late 1940s, right? So as the economic conditions got worse, a lot of people in the U.S. government were like, well, we got to do something, right? We got to, we can't let this just drift, right? Because the last thing we want is Europe going communist. I mean, our whole project here is stopping that from happening. So they developed a plan whereby they would provide economic assistance to Europe. It was called the European Economic Recovery Program, also now known as the Marshall Plan. It was named after George Marshall, who was instrumental in setting it up, and Truman really respected Marshall a great deal and named it after him, although he was not the only architect of it. But it was a program in which $13.3 billion were transferred to European governments on the premise that the European governments had to match it with their own currency. So if we give you X amount of money, $13 billion is in 2024 money about $174 billion, which seems like a lot of money, a billion here, a billion there, and soon you're talking real money. But it was a bipartisan program too. The Republicans voted for it just like the Democrats did. And the reason was because they wanted to forestall a communist takeover, which seemed, the communists were one of the largest parties in France. They were one of the largest parties in Italy. This was a big deal. This was a very worrisome thing. Now, the French ended up spending more money than we gave them for the Marshall Plan, losing the war in Indochina in the early 1950s. And Stalin basically told all of his representatives in Eastern Europe, you cannot participate in this plan at all, because he really saw it as a way of the United States trying to export free market capitalism, which it was. Because once again, once you get these countries back on their feet, what is it that happened to them that didn't happen to us? Well, they got most of their industry bombed out of existence. So they need a way of regenerating their economic base. And then what are they going to do? They're going to buy stuff. And who are they going to buy it from? From us. And that's really, so this is the birth of kind of American soft power, right? So, you know, you could say, well, we're going to send troops over there and we're going to like fight the communists. That's really expensive. As we found out in Korea, it's fabulously expensive. And by the way, and this is worth remembering about the way the U.S. government was sort of organizing itself in these days. 1945, the U.S. defense budget was $93 billion. 1947, the U.S. defense budget was $13 billion. And a lot of this was due to the actions of Defense Secretary Lewis Johnson, who was a big Democratic contributor. And if you read some histories of the Korean War, we really got caught with our pants down at the beginning of the Korean War because so much of the U.S. military capacity had been allowed to decay, in part because the defense budget had been cut down so low. And in fact, there were a number of people talking about getting rid of the Marine Corps because the Marine Corps duplicated something that the Army already did. Getting rid of the Navy. Why? Because we have the bomb and we don't need boats to deliver it. We have planes. These were BAMPOT ideas that were being discussed on both sides of the aisle. And by the way, so Truman really believed that he had a mandate from the American people to cut defense spending. I mean, the sort of slogan you would hear in 1945, 1946 was no boats, no votes. And who would be on those boats? The husbands and sons of people in the United States coming back from Europe or the Far East. The people were tired of war. They didn't want to have their sons, their husbands serving in the military. You know, they wanted them back in the United States where they could start families and start businesses. And, you know, there was a lot of pent-up demand from the war because of rationing. But the Republicans in Congress, under the leadership of Ohio Senator Robert Taft, also thought that having lots of people in the military was bad for democracy. Because being in the military, and I really recommend the book. It's by Michael Hogan, I think, and it's called The Cross of Iron, and it's about the origins of the national security state. The Republicans in Congress believed that serving in the military made you servile, that it was damaging to your democratic individualism. Now, I mean, it's weird to think about that given the sort of how people tend to think about things now, but this was very much a position that was taken by members of the Republicans in the Houses of Congress. Just how it was. But Truman is engaged in this process of cutting back the defense budget. Now, in April 1950, NSC 68 comes out. NSC is a National Security Council memorandum that's responsible for a lot of things that went on later, the foundation of the CIA. Also the idea that if we were going to fight communism around the world, it was going to cost money. And so it was recommended in the context of NSC 58 that the U.S. defense budget be raised to an annual rate of about $50 billion. So think about this, at the sort of, in the final year of the Second World War, $93 billion. Immediately after the Second World War, $13 billion. So imagine the idea of trying to tell Congress, you're going to be on the hook for $50 billion a year in military and defense spending. That was a hard sell at that time. This is Clark Clifford, who was responsible for what was one of the main people responsible for what was called the Clifford-Elsie report, which was another one of these reports that kind of illustrated, that was 1946, and it was part of this policy in which the U.S. sort of security policy establishment, such as it was trying to sort of come to terms with what the Cold War was going to cost, What is this really going to cost us? Clark Clifford later on was instrumental in turning the Johnson administration away from escalation of the Vietnam War in 1968. And later, in the 1980s, was involved in the BCCI scandal. Most of you, people mostly don't remember this, but he got involved with a crooked bank. And I remember seeing this interview with him where he was like, this is terrible because the only two conclusions you could really draw from this is that I'm either a crook or an idiot. Which he was neither one. He was just, I think, very naive about the people he got into business with. 1948, Truman ends up running for president. He's much more unpopular now by this point. He's really damaged his base. 1946, there was a wave of strikes, especially in the coal industry and the rail industry. And the rail industry strike got so bad that Truman, number one, got all the at that point, the rail was how a lot of business got done in the United States. And the rail strike was on the point of causing the U.S. economy to grind to a halt. So he had the leadership sort of in his office, or in the White House debating it. And he went to Congress and he said, if they don't settle the strike, we are going to draft every single one of the railway workers into the military. Even the Republicans in Congress were like, whoa, wait a minute here. And this really damaged his standing with his labor base. Because they were like, look, we allowed, there to be kind of no wage growth during the war. Now, prices are going up. We want our wages to go up too. Eventually the strike got settled, but it was very damaging to Truman. And he ended up running against Thomas Dewey. So Dewey had been the governor of New York. He was a Wall Street lawyer. He was a very cold man. He was advised by people in the right wing of the Republican Party to go hard on the sort of communist subversion thing. And Dewey said, no, I don't want to be looking under people's beds. Really, he took a very principled stand on it. By the late summer of 1948, he was so far ahead in the polls that the Republican Party stopped polling. He was also so-called, some of you may have heard me say this earlier, Alice Roosevelt, the former president's cousin, who was a real live wire, said of Dewey that he looked like the little man on the top of the wedding cake. Truman's response was to get on a train. He was ostensibly going to the West Coast to scope out some sort of architectural thing. I forget exactly the reason. But what he did was go on this cross-country train trip where they stopped at every little town, and every time he stopped, he would get out on the back of that train and give a speech. And the thing about Truman was that he really knew how to talk to people in small towns, because he was from one of them. He'd plowed a furrow. He knew what it was all about. He knew what their concerns were. And the concerns of a lot of people in Middle America were, we come out of the Depression. Because of the New Deal, I have a car now. And the Republicans want to do this sort of austerity before austerity was austerity. And maybe I'm not going to have a car anymore. So what tended to be the case in a lot of Middle America was that the people running the town would be Republicans, and the sort of people down the income distribution would be Democrats. And that was who Truman wanted to talk to. He was like, look, this is what the Democratic Party has done for you, and we want to do more of it for you. And this was a message that really got traction across the country. And ultimately, when the election happened, he squeaked out a win. You kind of can't see this because of the light. This is in the Chicago Daily Tribune, which was run by a guy who was an inveterate hater of both the Democratic Party and of Truman personally. So there's a reason why Harry Truman he could be holding up any newspaper, but he's holding a copy of the Chicago Tribune with the incorrect headline to make the point. In June of 1950, the Korean War starts. Those of you who saw my exhaustive discussion of the Korean War remember how badly we got surprised by that. But there were a couple of important aspects of the Korean War. One was that it really saved the Marine Corps, because the Marine Corps, number one, the only troops that they had combat ready to send after the sort of very unready troops in Japan was the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. So they sent them there, and those guys really held the line, and then were really instrumental, number one, in holding the Pusan perimeter, then in the campaign that took them up north to the Chosin Reservoir. If you want my vote for greatest American general of the 20th century, it would be O.P. Smith, the Marine Corps general who led the forces going up the east side of the country. If he had not slow-walked he slow-walked, and if he had been in the Army chain of command, he would have been cashiered, but he was a Marine, and they didn't want to have sort of inter-service quarrel. But he built a series of supply bases on the way up the eastern side of the peninsula, and the Marines managed to retreat in pretty good order when 400,000 Chinese came across the Yalu. But it also changed the calculus of American politics, right? Because the ideas of NS-68, which came out right around at this time, like a month earlier, 2 months earlier, the idea of spending $50 million a year for, in the defense budget had seemed kind of outlandish until this happened. At which point people were like, oh yeah, maybe. Also, 1949, China falls. And this is a key moment. So the period 1948, 1949 is one of the most crucial moments in American history. China falls, and there's a lot of blame put on Truman, the Democrats, people in the State Department. And I liken this in my talks about the Korean War to, a doctor who gets assigned a patient who's got stage 4 cancer, fails to cure him, and then the family comes to him and tells him he's soft on cancer. By the time the U.S. got involved in the Civil War in China, it had been going on for a long time. Chiang Kai-shek's government was corrupt as hell. And in fact, at one point, Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, met with Wellington Koo, the Chinese ambassador, and told him, look, our estimates show that about 45% of the material that we're sending to you ends up in the hands of the communists, either because they take it or because your commanders sell it to them. And if that number gets over 50%, you're going to have to start asking yourself whether it's worth us continuing to send that over there. Also, the Republican Party is in a process of transition right now. Robert Taft dies of pancreatic cancer, I believe, around this time. And the right wing of the Republican Party is a little bit up in arms about things. Number one, the Republicans have lost now 5 presidential elections in a row after 48. They didn't really want Dewey. The right wing of the Republican Party didn't want Dewey. The right wing of the Republican Party is very isolationist, and Dewey is more of an internationalist, more associated with Wall Street banks. The right wing of the Republican Party is like, well, we have to really bang the anti-communist thing heavily, the communist subversion issue, to the extent there was some. This is the time that Joe McCarthy becomes more prominent. McCarthy, who was constantly saying, he said, I have this list of communist agents in the State Department, which he never managed to produce. And the problem for these people is how to get people at the sort of lower end of the income distribution to vote against their immediate economic interest, what they perceive to be their immediate economic interest. And the answer turns out later to be George Wallace. I mean, George Wallace comes out as a sort of rebel Democrat back in the days of the Solid South and says, segregation tomorrow, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And that sort of wing looks at that and it's like, oh yeah, let's get people upset about the race thing, and that'll get them sort of distracted from the fact that they have a car now. That's a very back of the envelope way of saying it, and it's rather more complicated than that. And I'm kind of close to the end of my time, so I'm spitballing here a little bit, but. I really recommend David Halberstam's The Coldest Winter, because he does a really interesting analysis of the way that this shaped the politics of the Republican Party. I mean, really a lot of the politics of our current moment was shaped in 1948, 1949. At this point, Truman is still kind of unpopular, especially, once again, this war has gotten going. He's having to send American sons and husbands into combat, which is a very unpopular thing to do, especially because most Americans don't know where Korea is, much less care about who ends up running that country. The thing ends up in a stalemate. In the middle of it, he ends up having to fire MacArthur. MacArthur had famously come out in favor of using the atomic bomb. The Joint Chiefs of Staff thought that this was a terrible idea because they didn't think that it would achieve the military ends that MacArthur said it would. But more importantly, as a general, you don't get to come out in public and do that. Like, as a general, you have to execute the policy of the people who get to make the policy, which is the people in the executive branch. And if you don't like it, you're welcome to resign. That's the normal course of things. If I'm in the State Department, if I'm in the military, and I don't agree with the sort of general policy, and I can't in good conscience execute it, I resign. It's just as simple as that. That's the way our system works, and it's the only way our system can work. Truman later said, and some of you have heard me quote this before, it's unclear whether he actually said this, but it definitely reflects something he thought. He's supposed to have said to a reporter who interviewed him after he was no longer president anymore, I fired MacArthur because he was insubordinate. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was. Being dumb isn't a crime for generals. If it was, about a third of them would be in prison. And this partly reflects his view that the generals tended to be spendthrift. But it also reflects his view. I mean, the guy was a captain. He was an artillery captain, and he had that sort of hinkiness about the upper level command. So what ends up happening in the United States is that MacArthur comes back to the United States and thinks he's going to be given the Republican nomination sort of by affirmation or what have you. But he fares badly in congressional hearings because it turns out that although he tried to claim that he had been alive to the threat of communists invading, of the Chinese communists invading when they went into the northern part of Korea, it turned out that there was a stenographic record of his comments at the Wake Island Conference in 1950, and in fact he had said that there was no danger of that. Other parts of his reputation aged less well too, and so the Republican nomination goes to Dwight Eisenhower, who, by the way, the Democrats also wanted to nominate. Let's back up and tell a little story about Eisenhower, and this comes out of Gene Edward Smith's biography of Franklin Roosevelt predominantly, although there's a number of other, and also his book about Eisenhower. Eisenhower had an affair while he was serving in Europe with Kay Summersby, his secretary and driver, British woman. And he eventually, at the end of the war, sent a letter to George Marshall, the commander of the U.S. Army, saying that he wanted to be posted to Europe so that he and Kay Summersby could shack up together. And George Marshall sent him back a letter saying, absolutely not. If you don't rescind this request, I will destroy your career, basically. So, and Eisenhower saw the light of reason. Yes, as he should have done. Jesus, can the bar really be that high? I just don't understand. Anyway, people knew about this letter, right? So at a certain point during the presidential election in 1952, I always forget that the election happens the year before someone becomes president. Eisenhower's running against Estes Kefauver. And Joseph McCarthy lets it be known that he's going to give a speech in which he's going to accuse Kefauver of being a communist sympathizer and a homosexual. Oh. The Democrats get wind of this. People in the Truman administration get in touch with the Eisenhower campaign and say, look, if McCarthy does this, we are immediately going to release the letter that you wrote, that your candidate wrote to George Marshall. And the Eisenhower campaign, once again, saw the light of reason and got with McCarthy and said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Truman later had the letter destroyed as a courtesy to Eisenhower. Eisenhower very much disliked Truman for this reason. I mean, partly it was because he thought that Truman had too aggressively cut the military budget. Partly he just didn't like him personally, but also the tradition was that the sitting president, would set up a security briefing for the presidential candidates. And somehow the organization got messed up, and Eisenhower was not invited to this, and Eisenhower really took it personally. To the extent that another tradition was that the incoming president will, on inauguration day, will drive to the White House, have lunch with the outgoing president, then they will drive together to the inauguration. Eisenhower drove to the White House and then refused to come inside and forced Truman to come out to the car, after Bess had put on this very nice lunch, and just drive with him to the inauguration. And the only conversation they had in what must have been one of the most incredibly awkward car rides in the history of American politics was that Eisenhower said, "My son, who's a military officer serving in Korea, got a furlough to come here for the inauguration. Was that your doing?" Truman just said, "Yep." And that was it. That was the extent of the conversation. And so Eisenhower becomes president, and a new phase of the Cold War opens, which I will discuss apparently in April. Truman went back to independence, to live with Bess, try and sort of recoup some of his economic fortunes, which were not that great. I mean, the presidency just really didn't pay all that well. And neither did service in the Senate. I mean, for a long time during his service in the Senate, he was living in a corner apartment in
Sounds dope.
yeah. It's not there's a kind of penumbra of earning opportunities that you can set yourself up for, but just service in Congress actually doesn't necessarily pay all that well. I say this, they make a lot more money than I do, but I'm a librarian. I'm not in it for the newsflash. I'm not in this business for the money. I'm in it to help people. He lived until 1972. He in the 1960s gave a series of interviews in which he made that famous comment about, or may have made that famous comment about Eisenhower, and also probably, and I think that there's more truth to this probably, told the story about having the Eisenhower letter to George Marshall destroyed, because that's the kind of guy he was. He really didn't think that kind of thing should be used against. I mean, he thought that I'm sure that he thought that Eisenhower's conduct in that moment was reprehensible, but he didn't think that it was a good thing that that should be hanging over Eisenhower. And once again, Truman was just a decent guy. And this is, if you take nothing else away from my lecture about Harry Truman, the fact of the matter is that he is as close to what you get if you just took a normal American off the street and made them president. And it turned out that we got somebody who really embodied the best instincts of American civilization. I mean, sometimes it can be hard for us to see them, especially when we're all grousing at each other. But the fact of the matter is, there's a kind of baseline decency among Americans, and Truman was a perfect avatar of that way of thinking. And so his reputation has a little bit suffered because of the Korean War, because of the sort of draconian way he won. I mean, he thought that he suggested in private that he thought all the leaders of the trade union should be shot. During the rail strike, he was a little upset at them because he really felt like he had tried to do a lot for them and that they were not paying him back. They were not returning the favor. But the United States has a sort of long history of, in moments of real trauma and moments of real need, of getting the right guy, cometh the hour, cometh the man. I mean, Truman was the right guy in that moment. Perhaps the only guy who could have filled the shoes of Franklin Roosevelt. And in that respect, much as history has not been terribly kind to him, I think the Truman presidency illustrates the great good fortune of the country. So, thanks for listening. I'll take questions.